Hello, my name is Craig Mooney. I'm an artist. I currently live in New England and I paint full time. I had no ambition as a young person to be an artist as a job. That was not something I wanted to pursue. I always wanted to do art only really for myself. And my father was a professional and he felt very strong. My father grew up during the Depression. And he was a great artist, but he said, you don't want to struggle and you don't want to, it's too hard to make a living and stuff like that. But eventually that's what happened. So I became an artist. My story starts way back in the early 70s in New York City, where I was born and raised. My father was a amateur artist. He was a physician, but he painted on the weekends, and my mother worked. We lived fairly close to the UN, the United Nations, in Midtown Manhattan. And during the weekends, the city was desolate. Definitely, especially in the 70s, you would that picture of New York City as a bustling metropolis. On the weekends, it was very quiet in my neighborhood. And we used to go around and walk through the city, and we came across a big trove of art supplies that someone had thrown out, probably a diplomat, very, very close to the United Nations. And I remember bringing them back to our apartment, and that was really the first time I painted on a canvas. And I was probably 6 years old, and I still have the painting that I started with my father on. And that sort of started the journey of me using paint on canvas. And at that time, probably because the supplies that we found were relatively free, you felt sort of free in expression in terms of painting on such a large canvas, which was probably even linen at the time, as opposed to going into a store and purchasing all these expensive materials. We were sort of gifted with them. So we had a certain freedom to do as we wanted. And that sort of started my journey in painting. Throughout my childhood, I went through high school, and I just so happened to live in a building in Manhattan where there were filmmakers that were close friends of my parents. And they were constantly working on movies, and they were the filmmaking team, Merchant and Ivory, Ismail Merchant and James Ivory. And one of the first jobs I had as an artist was working on one of their sets in Texas for a movie called Ballad of the Sad Cafe. And I remember I had to come up with the cafe sign that they used in the film. And I think I was 18 or 19 when I did that. During and after college, I pursued film. I always painted. I still painted, but I did it really for myself. I felt comfort in that. I was very, very quiet about it. I didn't display the work, and I wasn't represented by any galleries. Eventually, I worked in medical research, and that moved me up to Vermont. And it wasn't until sometime in the mid-90s that the Department of Office of Public Affairs for New York Hospital contacted me. And they wanted me to do artwork for their hospital. And it actually just started as a Christmas card that they wanted, but it eventually developed into a series of paintings for the university there. And that I took as a sign. And being in rural New England at that time, I took advantage of the space that I had. And I set up a studio and I painted. And I left my day job. Eventually, I had a little bit of success. I took that success and I moved back to New York City, and I sort of had a reckoning there. It was very difficult at that time to break in. This would have been before 2000. I worked a lot in the public relations field when they needed an artist. I did runway model drawings. I still worked in film. I had an opportunity to move back up to New England. I had a family member who had a business that needed some support, and of all things, sales. And they thought I'd be good at it, and it stuck. What it did was it allowed me to paint at my leisure, and it took the pressure of trying to make a living as an artist before my career had really before my artistic sort of sense, my artistic vision had sort of gelled. It allowed me to have the time and sort of like in an incubator, allow it to grow sort of organically. And I started at that point to get some recognition, which led to a gallery in Boston discovering me. And that sort of opened the doors back to, ironically, back to New York City, to a gallery there. And then when I moved up to Vermont, I found the landscape extremely compelling. And it reminded me very much of some of the Dutch and Flemish masters that had very dark brooding skies and sort of the chiaroscuro light formations. And the landscape in Vermont, in northern Vermont, is very harsh. The summers are very short, but they're extremely beautiful. And the skies are just extremely dramatic, mostly because of the mountains that are the Adirondacks and how they move over to the Green Mountains. And I felt compelled to paint them. One of the funny things, though, was my earlier paintings were very dark because almost every day was a cloudy day. And maybe there'd be a shaft of light coming down, and I would paint that. And over time, I was able to expand on that a little bit, and there were other artists that were very influential at that time. My father would have been the first major influence. His work was very sparse, but it was very sophisticated. Stuart Shills and Eric Aho and Jeffrey Blondes were three artists that were very influential in my earlier stage of the career. They were probably more established at that time than I was, but not by much. What I really enjoyed was the atmospheric quality of a painting, a big brooding sky, maybe a low horizon line. And also what I was very much attracted to was the abstraction of most of it. Instead of trying to specifically render something so that it looks almost exact, like an impressionist would, to have sort of a capacity to leave the details out and really use big brushes and just to get the feeling down. So it became more of a pursuit of getting the feeling, the atmospheric feeling of the painting. And a lot of the works became very loose in style and more immediate. And almost like when you paint with watercolors, you have to put that down relatively quickly and then it dries. With an oil painting, obviously you can always go back to it. But I wanted to capture a quality that was immediate, that showed movement, that forced me, using large brushes like 3-inch brushes and palette knives and stuff, to take out the details, because it was too difficult to put the details in at that point, and it was unnecessary, I felt. The end result was I was building a collection of work that was very cinematic in nature. It had some sort of brooding quality to it. It had an element of energy and maybe mystery to it. A lot of that was because of how the painting was constructed. Not having the specifics of a painting left it more mysterious. The viewer also, it's almost, the abstract qualities of the work were apparent when you saw the painting up close, but when you walk back, the vision would sort of coalesce and it would come into focus. And I love that. I just felt that created a certain power in the piece, and it allowed me really to capture the elements that I was interested in. And over the years, the landscape was really the linchpin of the work that I did, but I started to miss the city. I'd always painted cityscapes, even when I lived in New York City, and I started to apply the same techniques to the cities that I grew up in. And at first, the memories I had of living in the city were the quiet streets surrounded by huge office towers that were empty. And a lot of the earlier works, you'll see maybe a lone figure or just a completely empty street. People would comment on how it didn't look like the city because there were throngs of people and masses of traffic. And I would explain, well, this was my experience. It's slightly different. One of the qualities of living in northern New England is you have to deal a lot with snow. And with bitter cold temperatures, it's almost unavoidable, but there is a beauty to it. And I find it's sometimes my most creative time of year is in the winter months in the studio. You have to do so much. The road driving out to my studio sometimes can be blocked with drifts of snow. You need a four-wheel drive vehicle to get there. But the beauty of it, it's so cold, it's almost like life has frozen, and the trees are, with the light coming through it, is beautiful. But I felt that there were ways to depict the snow in a way that, like with the more traditional landscapes that I did, which were in the summer months or autumn or fall, that could be equally dramatic because you still had these skies. Sometimes even more dramatic, even in the wintertime, than you would have in the summertime. You would have, and there was more subtlety, more nuance to them, because you almost had the white blanket of snow as a blank canvas that would reflect certain bits of light, and felt compositionally that it was just as dynamic to do a winter scene. And not a lot of people were doing winter pieces. It's not something that a lot of people around the world look for. But for me, it was something that I responded to. And again, I'd seen certain artists that I admire render snow in a way. There were more traditional artists that, when I moved up to Vermont, Thomas Curtin is one, that had more of a traditional feel to them. And I felt that what would be nice would be to, or something that I felt compelled to do, would be to do an updated, more contemporary feel to the painting, to make it almost abstract, but to give the hint or the suggestion of winter and a snowfield, and then cloud coming over, and maybe a suggestion of a horizon. And I felt I hadn't really seen that, and so I decided that I would make a series of paintings that way, and I still do. I still paint those. Like the advent of painting the snow scenes, I started to spend more time on the coast of the United States, in New England in particular, Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Maine, and the light there is very, I guess, would be similar maybe to Brittany or something in France. There's a particular quality of the cloud formations over the ocean, and then the power of the ocean. When you're dealing with a landscape, more of something you would see in New England, you had certain elements. The land was pretty much the platform of which everything was built upon, the atmosphere. But when you're painting an ocean or a seascape, the ocean or the bottom piece is also fluid, and it changes and it reflects light. And I felt the power of the sea, not to sound too much in cliche, was something I was very much drawn to. But it was hard to figure out a way to make a contemporary feeling painting and not make it too traditional. I didn't want to do something that was like a Winslow Homer, even though I was a great admirer of Winslow Homer or of Whistler. I really wanted something that felt contemporary, and also to capture the immediacy of the cloud formations. I did a painting when I used to come to Vermont, which was of a valley, and in the valley there'd be one little church steeple, and above that would be this massive sky. Usually it would be brooding, maybe almost stormy clouds. And I sort of did that with the seascapes, and instead of the church steeple, it was now a sail, like a single sailboat, like a little suggestion of a sail with towering clouds above it and a very deep, dark Prussian blue sea. So that was something that I felt very strongly about, was trying to convey a sense of depth and power that was in the ocean and sort of the change. Most of the seascapes are not very whimsical feeling, but they have the same sort of sense of drama. I guess when I was starting out, I didn't think much about the quality of the pigments that I got. I would get the cheapest ones that I could get. Oil painting, as you know, can be very expensive. Some tubes of paint can be $100 if you. But when I had a studio in New York City, and I was starving. I wasn't really making it, and it was a question of could I afford pigments. I went down to, there was a place in New York, a couple places in the city that had handmade pigments, and I went down and they allowed me to take a tube of paint out and squirt it out, and they showed me the vibrancy of the color. So that gave me like an early indication that I needed to spend a little bit more on the quality of the pigments that I use. And I'm not talking about Old Holland or anything, but Williamsburg or Holbein are excellent pigments. I try to keep the range of pigments within, or the range of pigments within a certain range. The blues I'm generally drawn to are Prussian blue and Indian yellow. Some of the reds are the alizarin crimson. And as far as the tools that I use, I've never been very good at taking care of brushes. And so I find it kind of laborious. So I would get hardware store brushes. And then that led to me getting other items that you would find in a hardware store, like a putty knife or a drywall blade, which are very flat and that you can scrape across the canvas, and you get a sense of this unevenness of texture. You're sort of creating happy accidents in the canvas, which are not intended, but what you get is something that's beautiful and you can incorporate into the painting. I still use some good quality paintbrushes, but for the most part, the actual instrument isn't as important. The quality of the pigment is important. So the money is spent there, really. And what I have available in the studio, whether it's a 3-inch brush that you get at a hardware store, that's usually a disposable one, or maybe some nylon brushes, I just to get enough to get the paint on the canvas. I think once the big struggle is always to get enough paint, and a lot of the canvases I paint are large. Some are 5 by 5 feet, or they can be up to 3 meters. So that's always the challenge. So you're using sometimes trowels, and you're using all kinds of industrial equipment that's not meant to be used necessarily for art, but that I do. So that's a little bit about what I use technique-wise. The figurative is very interesting. It's sort of, I approach it the same way I approach the landscape. I try to make the subject matter feel familiar without being specific. I don't like to show a face, or I don't like to show anything. I had always thought about, and it's nothing against people who paint portraits for a living or something like that, but if you go and you see a painting of a person, even in a museum, it's not completely compelling to me if I don't know who that person is or who they were. But if you take the details out of the face, or maybe you don't show the face completely, then it can be anybody. And it could be you, in fact, in that. So for me, that sense of familiarity is created by the ambiguity of how the subjects are rendered. I have always, I grew up in a very, I should say the common thread through most of the work is that I grew up in a very busy, where the apartment where I was born and raised, and I grew up until we gave up till fairly recently, was located right in Midtown Manhattan. And it was usually very noisy. There were sirens, there were cars, everything like that. And I think even as a child, I always sought out quiet and things that gave peace and tranquility. And a lot of the figurative pieces, I want to sort of embody that. There's a female figure form that that's a popular motif of mine, where it's a sort of a woman in a sort of a prone position, just with the light sort of cascading on her back, and sort of a construct. It's almost like a symbolism for me. It isn't like a specific person or anything like that. I have worked with models in the past, but it's sort of unnecessary, because for me, I sort of already know how I want the composition to be, and I don't really need people to, I can sort of in my mind invent it. I feel that I want to convey a sense of something very cinematic, especially with a group of people around, or with a person walking down an alleyway or something like that. So something a little bit more mysterious.
Do you do plein air?
No, I do not. I had a bad plein air experience for a long time. I felt too self-conscious, I think, to do plein air. Whenever I would do plein air, there were two problems for me. One was I just didn't really like people coming up to me and asking what I was doing, and I felt compelled to explain. And by the time I was done explaining, I had my thought process was gone. I couldn't maintain my focus, put it that way. I'm a friendly person, and I would always be happy to talk to somebody, but then I would end up losing sort of the strand of what I was on when I was painting. The second thing was, there are so many, when I moved up to Vermont, for example, there were so many beautiful things to see. It was every time I turned the road, I felt compelled to pull off to the side of the road and try and paint that. And then a mile down the road, you see something even more spectacular and paint that. And I was driving myself crazy. So I felt that what would work better for me is to internalize it and to recreate those moments that I have seen, that I saw in the studio under controlled conditions. And I felt, to me, that was the perfect solution to what I was going through. And I felt that, most of the pieces that I do are imbued with an experience I've had or a place I've visited, and I've seen something, and that comes back into the artwork. I always tell this story to people who ask. When I was starting out many, many years ago, I was in an art show, and it turned out to be a terrible art show, and it wasn't really art that they were selling. It was more of a craft show, and I had spent a lot of money on this booth. It was very expensive, and it rained the entire weekend. And on the last day, a man entered the booth to look at my art, and he was very mysterious. He had a dark trench coat on, had a very thick Eastern European accent, and he looked at one of my paintings, and he commented on how I had captured Yugoslavia so well. And I agreed. I said, yes, I have. And I remember telling somebody this story, and he bought the painting, and it was not much money back then, but it was enough to at least cover my costs. And I mentioned this to a friend, and they said, well, you must have felt terrible. You had to lie to this person in order to, I said, no. I said, no, I actually had been to Yugoslavia. I had been there a couple times, and it was one of the most beautiful countries this is before the war in the 80s, one of the most beautiful parts of Europe I've ever seen. And I felt very strongly that, well, two things. One is I felt that the visions and imagination that I had used to create this painting that the gentleman liked so much had been built on those experiences of actually being in Yugoslavia. And it also led to another thing, which was, for me, I felt very strongly that the ambiguity of the work is something that's so important to the viewer, because it's sort of like not knowing the lyrics to a song. You invent them, and then years later you may look at the liner notes on an album and see that you were completely wrong, but you like your version better. And I didn't want to say it wasn't Yugoslavia, and I wanted them to see what they saw. So I felt that was that's a strong thread in my work, as I like to, and another quick story about that, I had sent work to a gallery in the UK, and it was a woman seated in a chair. You couldn't really see her. She was in silhouette. It's on my website. And in the background were just a very light suggestion of mountains, of a mountain range. It was gray in the background. And when the paintings arrived at the gallery, one of them sold right away, which was great. And the owner let me know, and he said, well, you forgot to title these. So I went ahead and titled them for you. I said, oh, okay. And he said, we sold Woman by the Sea. And I thought that was funny. I said, Woman by the Sea? I'm like, okay. All right. So he thought that was the ocean, but that worked for me because that's what he saw, and that's what the other client saw. And I felt that was sort of a very telling part of how I felt that my work should be viewed, is through the mystery of not knowing everything, having some pieces missing, and the viewer, whoever that might be, fills them in themselves. And it makes it more of a compelling piece, I feel. I think it's also, I remember when I was a child, very young kid, and I had there was a bank in our neighborhood, and I would sit there while my mother was doing whatever banking she had to do, which wasn't anything big. But the security guard would always come over, and he was a nice man, and we would look at this massive painting that was in the foyer, and it was a very abstract painting. But he would always ask me, what do you see in that? And I would try to pick out shapes in it. I'd say, well, that's a bus, and those are people over there waiting to get on the bus. I don't really remember what I had said at that time, but in a way, it was a completely abstract painting. It was almost like a Jackson Pollock. It was something very of that time. This was probably 1975 or something like that. And I always think about that because for me, it felt very real what I was seeing, even though I'm sure that was not the intent of the artist. I'm sure the intent of the artist was for you to have a feeling or something like that. But I don't know, for me, I feel that approach to the work has always made it interesting to me. And I always find it interesting when an observer sees something that I don't see. And yeah, that makes it sort of rewarding in a way. I've always felt very strongly that, and maybe that ties in a little bit with the cinematic aspect of the work. Not so much a need to please the viewer, but maybe a need not to explain it so that they can come across their own meaning. So. When I started to get recognized, which was probably around the early 2000s, which was, I had gone full-time as an artist probably 3 times, and the first 2 times were pretty miserable. Both times I think I headed back to New York City, and I had a studio in Long Island City, but it was so hard to keep up with this. And being from New York, it was odd too. Art can be such a fragile thing, and there's usually a little voice, but it can be influenced. And if you're in a big city sometimes, like New York, and there are a million artists and a million shows and a million everything's to keep, you sort of lose your voice a little. Let's see. So when I started getting recognized, which was around 2003, the galleries in major cities started to show my work. So it was in New York, Boston, Atlanta, in the States, and then out west in California. And then that sort of branched out into the Midwest, which would have been Colorado, and then Sun Valley, Idaho. as well as adding more galleries on the East Coast. And it got to the point where I had over 20 galleries, probably 25 at the peak. And then over the course of, and then England, I started showing in London, I think about 10 or 12 years ago. That in turn led to the work being shown in Edinburgh in Scotland, and then in Milan, and then in Singapore, I think in Hong Kong. So the pandemic, well, first of all, the first big one was the housing crisis of 2008. The gallery I showed at New York closed. It didn't close exactly then, but it closed sort of as a result. I think that was the first major recession in a sense, and a lot of galleries are really struggling, especially in the United States, especially in New York City. Then with the pandemic was a very strange thing. People were still buying art because they couldn't travel. They couldn't go to Europe on a vacation, or they couldn't, they were stuck at home. But I think some galleries couldn't manage it successfully because it was a very difficult time. And obviously I couldn't travel. What I had been doing was making it a point to travel to most galleries, several times a year. So I was traveling a lot. In the States, I would go to Europe once a year, at least once a year, to check on galleries there. It's sort of in a state of flux again now that the pandemic is sort of waning. Of course, now we have other struggles. We have more of a financial pandemic going on now. I'm sure it's the same in France as it is in the rest of the world. So it's always a unique set of challenges, and it's always a difficult thing to address. I think for me, as long as I continue to focus on what I do and not worry too much about, the state of the economy, or then it seems to work out. The work hasn't changed. It was sort of funny, during the pandemic, I was still able to go to my studio because I'm usually in self-isolation as it is. So it was a time when I could actually work quite a bit. But it was also a lonely time. I couldn't see many of the people that normally I would have, including family members. But it was a difficult time. I think now is another challenging time. I think now, just with the economic crisis that are happening, it presents new challenges. So usually the end of the year and the beginning of the new year is more of a fallow period for me. It's usually a time to sort of review what has been done. My last show, my last show will be this month in London, at my gallery in London, which is a series of London cityscapes. And then after that, I have some commissions, and then it will just be, I will have a sort of a breather and have a month. Usually January is very quiet, and it's sort of a time to reflect and work on some pieces that are really just more experimental. Some things that I'm trying are a little bit more abstract. It's a time it's sort of, we say fallow here, it's sort of the time when on a farm that you allow the crops to just, die and sort of fertilize the soil. And it's sort of a time for me really to think about the work for the upcoming year, next year, and shows and things like that. And then in February and March is when things will start to get busy again, in terms of galleries will want to line up their show schedules and stuff like that, and I'll have to sort of negotiate that. So it's a sort of a tricky time.
How can people find you?
Well, you can find me on my website at craigmooneystudio.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Craig Mooney Artists. That's the easiest way. If people happen to be in the area and they want to see my studio, that's the best way to reach me and see if I'm around. And I have a very messy studio, not like this. This is pretty clean. So my studio is the one place where I can pretty much, I think you've seen the video, let my sort of hair down, and it's sort of a creative mess over there. It's organized, but it's kind of a mess. The only thing I would say, because it had been mentioned before, someone had mentioned it to me, was it was interesting how I had never decided to be a professional artist or to make that my life's work. It sort of happened more as, I more or less acquiesced into it as opposed to any form of ambition. And that, people that I know who are at different stages of their career can do it and make a living and support themselves, if it's their dream to do that. I had been very much discouraged along the line. I remember early in the 90s approaching galleries in New York with my portfolio, which you really don't do. That's not something you should be doing. Making a lot of mistakes, but it's been a very rewarding journey, and that's probably about it. I think it's,